It was a rainy day when she found herself at the airport, her suitcase rolling behind her as she hurried to catch her flight. She hadn't expected the storm to delay things, but the weather had a way of taking over everything. The flight was already running behind, and as usual, she didn't mind. It gave her a little more time to get lost in her thoughts before boarding. She had a busy week ahead, a much-needed visit to her parents. It had been a while since she'd seen them, and even longer since she'd had the chance to just relax. She had no idea that today would end up changing everything. It wasn't about the flight, or the weather, or even the people around her. It was about one single moment, a small interaction that would lead to something she could never have imagined. As the passengers began boarding, she saw a young girl sitting alone in the waiting area. She was a small thing, no older than 6 or 7, her tiny hands gripping a teddy bear. The girl's eyes were puffy, and she seemed to be trying not to cry. She was looking down at her lap, her shoulders trembling just a little. The woman felt a pang of sympathy. She wasn't sure why, but she couldn't ignore the child's distress. It was clear the girl was alone, and for a brief moment the woman thought about saying something. But then the girl's father appeared. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and looked somewhat out of place in the busy, noisy airport. His eyes were dark, and he had a look of exhaustion about him. He seemed like he had been awake for days. His hair was disheveled, and his suit looked like it had been through a long journey. She noticed he wasn't carrying a briefcase or any of the usual accessories of a businessman. It was just him and the little girl, whose face brightened as she saw him approach. The woman smiled at the sight of their reunion. The father leaned down to give the girl a hug, his movements slow, deliberate, as if he was trying to make up for lost time. But she noticed something that made her heart ache, the sadness in his eyes. She didn't know why, but it was obvious to her that this wasn't a simple trip for him. There was a heaviness about him, a burden he was carrying that he couldn't quite hide. The woman felt a strange pull to help, but she didn't want to intrude. So she made her way to her gate, hoping that the girl would be all right. As she boarded the plane and found her seat, she tried to settle in for the long flight ahead. The woman's seat was near the back, a window seat with a perfect view of the clouds and the stormy sky outside. She closed her eyes for a moment, grateful for the brief peace before the flight took off. She looked at the row of passengers in front of her and saw that the little girl was now sitting next to her father, who seemed to be doing his best to calm her down. The girl wasn't crying anymore, but her face was still streaked with tears. The woman glanced over at them but didn't want to seem like she was staring. Just as the plane began to taxi down the runway, the child's voice broke the silence. "Daddy, I'm scared." The woman could hear the soft plea in the girl's voice, and for a moment it tugged at her heart. She wanted to do something, but what could she do? She didn't know them, and it wasn't her place to interfere. But then she saw the father's face. His brow was furrowed, his lips pressed into a tight line as if he was trying to figure out what to say. She could see the struggle in his eyes. He wanted to comfort her, to reassure her, but it was clear that words weren't enough. The woman felt a sudden urge to help. Without really thinking about it, she stood up from her seat and made her way down the aisle. She walked over to the father and his daughter, who were now sitting quietly in their seats, the child clutching her teddy bear tightly. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice gentle. "I know this might sound strange, but would you mind if I tried to help? I'm a teacher, and sometimes I know a little trick that can help kids feel better on planes. I've seen it work before." The man looked up, surprised by her sudden appearance. He seemed a little taken aback, but after a moment he nodded. I don't know. She's just really nervous about flying," he said, his voice carrying an unmistakable weariness. The woman smiled. "I understand. If you don't mind, I could sing her a lullaby. It might help her relax." The man hesitated for a moment before nodding again. "All right. If you think it will help." The woman settled into the empty seat next to the little girl who was still holding onto her teddy bear. The child's eyes were wide with curiosity, but there was still that sadness in her expression. The woman took a deep breath, trying to soothe her own nerves. She wasn't used to singing in front of strangers, but she knew how much comfort a familiar tune could bring, especially to a child. She began softly, her voice quiet but steady. It was an old lullaby, the kind that mothers used to sing to their children when they needed comfort. She didn't expect much, just a little hope that it would help the girl feel safe. As the melody filled the air, she could see the little girl's shoulders slowly relax. The sound seemed to have a calming effect, and the woman continued, unaware of the father's watchful gaze on her. The father had stopped trying to comfort his daughter himself, and instead, he watched as the woman's gentle voice seemed to work like magic. The child's eyes started to flutter, the tension in her small body easing little by little. The lullaby was a soft, rhythmic sound, and before long, the girl's head tilted to the side and her eyelids began to close. The woman's voice trailed off, and she glanced at the father, noticing for the first time just how exhausted he seemed. He hadn't said much since their brief exchange, but there was a heaviness about him that she couldn't ignore. He smiled at her, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, but there was gratitude there nonetheless. "Thank you," he said quietly. "She's been like this ever since we left home. I didn't think I'd be able to calm her down." The woman nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction. "Sometimes all it takes is a little kindness," she said, almost to herself. The plane continued its journey through the stormy sky, and the woman stayed quietly in her seat, watching as the little girl finally fell asleep, her breathing slow and steady. The father, too, seemed to relax, though he still looked lost in his thoughts. The woman didn't press him for more conversation. She simply sat there, a stranger offering a small comfort in the midst of a difficult situation. But there was something more beneath the surface, a feeling that there was something important about this moment, something that in time she would come to understand. As the hours passed, the woman drifted off to sleep herself, the hum of the airplane a comforting lullaby in the background. But she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just changed in some small but significant way. She didn't know how or why, but she felt it. This chance encounter, this simple act of kindness, would lead to something far beyond what she could have imagined. The plane was still flying through the thick clouds, the world outside veiled in a soft gray haze. The woman sat quietly, her gaze wandering out the window, her thoughts drifting far from the confines of the plane. She thought about the brief moment she had spent comforting the little girl, and how quickly it had made her feel like part of something bigger than herself. There was something special about that kind of connection, a moment shared with a stranger, bound by a simple act of kindness. She glanced over at the father, who was still seated beside his daughter. His eyes were closed, his face etched with the strain of a long, difficult journey. He had said very little after she had sung the lullaby, but his silent gratitude had been enough. It wasn't often that people opened up like that, especially not to strangers. The woman had sensed the burden he was carrying, but she didn't press him for details. Some things, she understood, were too personal to share with anyone but those closest to you. As the hours passed, she found herself growing more and more curious about this man and his story. He was clearly wealthy, but wealth didn't seem to bring him the comfort that most would expect. There was something about him, his quiet demeanor, his way of keeping to himself, that made her wonder. Who was he really? What had brought him to this point in his life? And what had happened to the woman who had been by his side? But as the flight continued, she tried to push those questions aside. It wasn't her place to pry, and besides, she had her own things to focus on. She was supposed to be relaxing after all, not getting caught up in someone else's problems. Yet no matter how hard she tried, her curiosity about him lingered. It was like there was something in the air, a connection she couldn't ignore. At one point, the flight attendants passed by with a cart offering drinks and snacks. The woman politely declined, but then she noticed that the father was awake now, his daughter still asleep beside him. He looked over at her, and for the first time his expression softened into something closer to a smile. "Thank you again," he said quietly, his voice low enough that it wouldn't disturb his daughter. "I don't know what it is, but I feel like she's been more relaxed since you sang to her." "You really have a gift," she smiled back, feeling a warm sense of satisfaction. "It's nothing, really. I'm just happy I could help." He nodded, but there was a sadness in his eyes that she couldn't quite place. "It's been a tough few years. I'm not used to having to do things like this on my own." The woman didn't know what to say. She could feel the weight of his words, and she understood the pain that often came with grief. She didn't press him, though, sensing that he wasn't quite ready to share more. Instead, she simply nodded and offered him a reassuring smile. "It's all right. You're doing your best. That's all anyone can do," she said gently. He seemed to appreciate her words, but there was still a lingering quietness between them. The woman wondered if he was just tired, or if there was something deeper troubling him that he couldn't express. She didn't know him, after all. He was just another person on the plane, like the thousands of others she had crossed paths with in her life. Yet there was something different about him, something that made her feel as though their encounter was more than just a coincidence. As the flight neared its destination, the father finally spoke again. His voice was softer now, and he looked at her as if weighing his words carefully. "I'm sorry if I've been distant," he said. "It's just that I haven't really talked to anyone in a long time. It's easier for me to keep everything inside." The woman didn't know how to respond at first, but she felt a deep sense of empathy for him. Grief had a way of isolating people, pulling them into themselves and making them feel like no one could truly understand what they were going through. It was clear that he had been through something painful, something that had changed him in ways he hadn't fully processed yet. "It's okay," she said softly. "You don't have to explain anything to me. But if you ever do feel like talking, I'm happy to listen." He gave a small, appreciative nod. "Thank you. Maybe one day I will." For the rest of the flight, they didn't speak much more. The little girl remained asleep in her seat, her small form curled up against her father's side. He kept glancing out the window, lost in thought, while the woman sat back in her seat, her own mind racing with questions. There was so much she didn't understand about him, about the life he had led before this trip, about the struggles he was facing. But she knew one thing for sure. There was more to him than met the eye. Finally, the plane began its descent, and the familiar sounds of the engines shifting gears and the seatbelt sign lighting up signaled that they were nearing their destination. The woman's heart began to race in anticipation of her visit with her family. It had been so long since she'd seen them, and she couldn't wait to catch up on everything. But as the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, she realized that she wasn't just looking forward to her visit. She was also strangely reluctant to leave the man and his daughter behind. There was something about them that had stirred something deep inside her, something that she couldn't quite explain. She didn't know what would happen next, but she had a feeling that this wasn't the last time she would cross paths with them. As the passengers began to gather their things and prepare to leave the plane, she noticed the father looking around, his daughter still asleep beside him. He was struggling to gather their things, clearly preoccupied with keeping everything in order. She stood up, grabbed her bag, and made her way over to them. "Do you need a hand?" she asked, offering her assistance. He looked up surprised, but then nodded gratefully. "I'd appreciate it." "Thank you." Together they gathered their belongings, and she helped him with the small tasks that were a little more challenging with a child in tow. The little girl stirred as they were getting ready to disembark, blinking sleepily and rubbing her eyes. She gave a small, confused smile when she saw the woman standing next to her father. "Did I fall asleep?" the girl asked, her voice still groggy. The woman nodded gently. "You did. You look so cozy now." The girl smiled at her, still a little shy, but there was a warmth in her gaze that made the woman's heart swell with a quiet sense of happiness. It was a small thing, but it felt meaningful. It felt like a moment that could not be undone. Once they were all off the plane, the woman waved them off as they walked toward the baggage claim area. The father paused for a moment, turning to look at her. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out," he said. His voice was genuine, but there was a heaviness to it. "Thank you again. For everything." She smiled and nodded, her heart full of gratitude. "I'm glad I could help. Take care of yourself. And her," she added, glancing at the little girl who was now holding tightly to her father's hand. With that, the man gave a brief nod and turned to walk away, his daughter following closely beside him. The woman watched them go, her heart still caught up in the strange connection she had felt with them. She didn't know why she felt so drawn to their story, but she knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning of something far bigger than she could have imagined. The days following the flight were filled with the usual busyness. The woman arrived at her parents' home, where she was warmly greeted and caught up with family matters. She felt the comfort of familiar surroundings, but something lingered in the back of her mind. The memory of the father and his daughter stayed with her, creeping into her thoughts when she least expected it. She had no idea why the brief encounter had affected her so deeply. It was just a chance meeting, after all. But still, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. She had told herself that it was a fleeting connection, nothing more than a moment of kindness shared between two strangers. But every time she thought about the father, the sadness in his eyes returned. The man had seemed so burdened, as if life had dealt him a cruel hand. He didn't look like the kind of person who could easily open up, yet he had spoken to her with a quiet honesty that left an impression. It was hard to ignore the pull she felt to know more about him. She tried to focus on her visit with her family, but the questions lingered. Who was he? What was his life like outside of the brief moment they had shared? What had happened to his wife? What was it like being a widower, raising a child on your own? She pushed these thoughts away, reminding herself that she couldn't get involved in the lives of strangers. She had her own life to live, her own responsibilities to attend to, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. It was as if something was pulling her toward him, urging her to understand more, to reach out in a way that felt both natural and necessary. A week passed, and her life seemed to return to its usual rhythm. She had her classes to teach, her routine to follow, but every now and then she'd catch herself thinking back to that moment on the plane. It wasn't just about the lullaby or the kindness exchanged. There was something deeper about their interaction, something that felt meaningful. One afternoon, as she sat in her living room, sipping tea and reading a book, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from an unknown number. She picked it up, curious. The message read, "I hope this isn't too forward, but I wanted to thank you again for what you did on the flight. My daughter hasn't been the same since. I didn't expect to hear from you, but I thought I should reach out." Her heart skipped a beat. It was from the father. The message was short, but it carried a weight that she could feel even through the words on the screen. She sat there for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She hadn't expected this, but part of her was relieved. It felt like the universe was giving her a chance to connect again, to see where this connection might lead. Taking a deep breath, she typed a response. "I'm glad to hear that your daughter is doing better. I hope the rest of your trip went smoothly. It was really my pleasure to help." She hesitated before pressing send. What did she want from this conversation? Was she just being polite? Or did she want to know more about him? The question hung in the air, but she sent the message anyway, deciding that she wasn't doing anything wrong by responding. Sometimes people just needed a little connection in their lives. A few moments later, another message came through. "I appreciate your kindness more than you know. It's been a difficult time for us. If you ever want to talk, or if you're ever in the area, I'd like to meet up and thank you properly. Maybe we could even do something for your own family. I can't help but feel that we've crossed paths for a reason." The words took her by surprise. She hadn't expected such an invitation, but the sincerity in his message was unmistakable. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, mixed with a sense of curiosity. What would it be like to meet him outside of the brief encounter on the plane? What could she possibly offer him? She had only helped his daughter calm down, but it seemed as if he was looking for something more, something deeper. After a moment of contemplation, she typed her response. "I'd love to meet up. I'm not sure what exactly we could do for my family, but I appreciate the offer. I'll be in touch soon." The decision felt right, even though she wasn't sure where it would lead. There was something about him, about them, that made her want to explore this connection further. She had never been one to reach out to strangers, but something about his message felt like an opportunity, not just for him, but for her as well. The next few days passed in a blur. The woman thought about the message often, her mind racing with possibilities. She wondered what kind of man he was and what had brought him to this point in his life. She imagined him sitting alone in a large, empty house, his daughter by his side, but still feeling the loneliness of losing his wife. It must have been so hard for him, raising a child on his own, carrying that weight of grief that never seemed to fully fade. Finally, she decided to take the plunge. She reached out and set up a time to meet. They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe in the city, a place where they could talk without the distractions of the outside world. The woman felt a flutter of nervousness as she prepared for the meeting, unsure of what to expect. She had no idea what kind of person he was beyond the brief moments they had shared on the plane. When the day arrived, she found herself standing outside the cafe, waiting for him. The air was crisp and the autumn leaves swirled around her feet, but her mind was elsewhere, focused on the man she was about to meet. She wondered what he would look like, if he would be the same man she had seen on the plane, or if the circumstances had changed him in some way. Just as she was beginning to doubt herself, she saw him approaching. He was dressed casually now, no longer in a suit, and his daughter wasn't with him. He walked toward her with a small smile, his expression warm but guarded. as if he wasn't sure what to expect either. "Hello," he said, his voice friendly but cautious. "Hi," she replied, smiling nervously. "I'm glad we could meet." They sat down at a table by the window, the soft hum of the cafe surrounding them. For a moment, neither of them spoke, just sitting in the silence. It was as if they both needed to take a moment to adjust to the newness of this encounter. Finally, he spoke again. "I wasn't sure if you'd agree to meet, but I've been thinking a lot about our conversation and I thought, maybe it's time to stop hiding." She nodded, understanding more than he realized. It's not always easy to open up, especially when things are difficult, but sometimes we just need someone to listen. His gaze softened. "That's exactly it. I've been trying to do it all on my own, but it's been exhausting. And the thing is, I know I can't keep going like this. My daughter needs more than just a father who's barely holding it together, and honestly, I don't know what I'm doing anymore." She listened carefully, her heart aching for him. He was so open, so vulnerable, and yet there was a quiet strength in his words. He wasn't asking for sympathy, but rather understanding. And for the first time in a long time, he seemed to feel like he wasn't alone. "Raising a child by yourself is never easy," she said gently. "But you're doing the best you can, and that's what matters." He nodded, his eyes momentarily distant. "I wish I could believe that. But I don't know if I can keep up this facade. It's hard to pretend everything's fine when it isn't." She reached across the table, offering a comforting smile. "You don't have to pretend. You've already taken the hardest step, admitting that you need help." He seemed to absorb her words, his posture softening as he let out a long breath. "I think you're right. Maybe it's time to stop pretending." The conversation flowed naturally from there, and as they talked, the woman realized that this wasn't just a meeting between two strangers anymore. It was the beginning of something else, something that had the potential to change both of their lives. As the days passed after their meeting, the woman found herself thinking more and more about the conversation she had shared with the father. There was something about their exchange that had shifted something within her. It wasn't just about offering comfort or a kind word. It was about the realization that sometimes a small connection could have a ripple effect, changing both people in ways they didn't expect. After their meeting, they continued to stay in touch. The messages grew longer, their exchanges more frequent. At first, it was about small things, their work, their families, their everyday lives. They both found comfort in the simplicity of those conversations. They didn't have to share their deepest fears or darkest secrets. They just needed someone to listen, someone to talk to who wasn't caught up in the weight of their own lives. And as they spoke more, they both began to realize something. They were both looking for the same thing. For the father, it was an escape from the loneliness that had consumed him since his wife's passing. It was clear that he had carried the burden of grief for so long, thinking that he had to do everything on his own, that he had forgotten what it felt like to lean on someone else. But in the woman, he found someone who understood the weight of that grief, someone who didn't ask him to fix himself, but simply offered empathy and understanding. For the woman, it was something more subtle. She had always been the one who took care of others, the one who offered advice and comfort, but she had never really allowed herself to lean on someone else. There was something in the way the father listened to her, something in the way he didn't rush to offer solutions or try to fix things. It made her feel seen in a way she had never felt before. And as they continued to talk, she began to understand that she wasn't just helping him. She was also helping herself. They spoke about everything and nothing at all. Work, childhood memories, their hopes for the future. Slowly, the distance between them that had been there at first began to fade. They weren't strangers anymore. They were two people, simply connecting in a world that often felt overwhelming. And in that connection, they found something unexpected: comfort. A few weeks after their initial meeting, the father invited her to meet again, this time for dinner. He had been busy with work as usual, but he wanted to show her his appreciation for the kindness she had shown him. The woman hesitated for a moment. She wasn't sure what to expect. She had never been the type to seek out deep connections, especially with someone she had met so briefly. But there was something about him that made her want to take that next step, to see where this strange bond could lead. When they met at the restaurant, it was different from their first encounter. There was a sense of familiarity now, a comfort that hadn't been there before. They greeted each other warmly, and as they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed easily. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation, just two people who had found common ground in a world that often felt isolating. Over the course of dinner, they talked about their pasts, their childhoods, their families, the things that had shaped them into who they were. It was clear that the father had been through a lot, and although he still carried the weight of his grief, there was a softness in his eyes now, a kind of peace that hadn't been there before. It was as if, with each conversation, he was slowly allowing himself to heal, one step at a time. The woman listened, offering gentle words of comfort when needed, but more often than not, she simply let him speak. She didn't try to fix him. She didn't offer advice. She just listened, and in doing so, she gave him something he hadn't realized he needed: the space to heal at his own pace. As the evening wore on, they moved from the small talk of everyday life to more personal matters. The father spoke about his wife, the love they had shared, the loss that had come when she passed away. He told her about the difficult times, about the days when he felt as if he couldn't go on, when everything seemed too much to bear. He spoke of the struggle of being a single father, the constant battle between wanting to be there for his daughter and the overwhelming desire to shut himself off from the world. "I don't think I ever fully realized how much I needed someone," he said quietly, his voice tinged with a mix of sadness and gratitude. "I thought I could do it on my own. I thought I could just keep going, pushing through the pain. But now I see how wrong I was." The woman reached across the table, placing a hand on his. She didn't need to say anything. She just wanted him to know that he wasn't alone anymore. "I think we all get to a point where we realize we can't do it all by ourselves," she said softly. "Sometimes the best thing we can do is let others in, let them help us carry the weight." He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I never thought I'd be the kind of person to ask for help. But you've made me realize that it's okay. It's okay to let someone else in." There was a quiet moment between them, a moment where the world seemed to slow down just a little. It was as if the weight of everything, the grief, the loneliness, the pain, had been lifted, even if just for a moment. The woman could feel the shift in him, the subtle change in his energy. He was no longer the man who had been so closed off, so burdened by the past. He was someone who was slowly starting to open up again, to let others in. And it was clear that this journey wasn't just about him learning to heal. It was about both of them learning to trust again. As the night came to an end, the woman felt a sense of contentment that she hadn't expected. They walked out of the restaurant together, the cool evening air brushing against their faces. There was no rush, no need to say anything. They simply walked side by side, both of them understanding that something important had shifted between them. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something real, something that had the potential to grow into something more. "I'm glad we met," the woman said, breaking the comfortable silence. "I didn't expect it, but I'm glad it happened." "Me too," he replied, his voice soft. "I don't know what comes next, but for the first time in a long time, I'm starting to believe that maybe it'll be okay." As they parted ways that evening, the woman couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. She had started out as a stranger to him, a woman who had offered a simple kindness in a moment of need. But now they had something more, something that neither of them had expected. And whatever the future held, she knew that this was only the beginning. The weeks that followed were filled with change, though it came slowly, like the slow unrolling of a story with an uncertain ending. The woman and the father continued to meet, each time learning more about one another, but never rushing to define what was growing between them. It was a friendship, a deep connection, but they both knew it was also something more, something that neither of them had expected, but both had needed. For the father, the more they met, the more he found that he could finally begin to breathe again. The weight of grief that had once felt so suffocating started to loosen its grip. He could see the light of his daughter's smile more clearly, could enjoy the quiet moments with her, without the constant shadow of sadness clouding everything. He had spent so long building walls around himself, afraid of being hurt again, afraid of feeling more loss. But with the woman, he found someone who didn't judge him for his grief, someone who saw the parts of him that he had buried, the parts he had almost forgotten how to reach. The woman, on the other hand, found herself feeling lighter as well. She had always been the one to listen, to offer advice, to guide others through their troubles, but she had never allowed herself to truly let go and let someone else offer the same. She had been so used to standing strong, to keeping her emotions in check, that she had forgotten what it felt like to open up, to share her own fears, her own uncertainties. But with him it felt different. It felt safe. It wasn't just about what they gave each other, though. There was something about the way they both understood the pain of losing someone, the way they had both lived in silence for so long, feeling isolated in their own ways. And in that shared silence they began to heal together. One evening, as they sat in a quiet park, watching the sky slowly darken, the woman found herself thinking about the journey they had both taken. She remembered how distant he had seemed when they first met, the walls around him so high, the grief so thick that she wasn't sure if he would ever let anyone in. And yet, here they were, sitting side by side, the connection between them growing deeper with every conversation, every shared silence. She turned to him, her voice softer than usual. "I've been thinking about everything," she said, her eyes searching his face. "About how much has changed in such a short time. It's funny, isn't it? How sometimes you meet someone and it feels like you've known them forever, even though it's only been a few months." He nodded, looking out at the park, the trees swaying gently in the evening breeze. "I know what you mean," he said quietly. "I never thought I could feel like this again, like there's hope, like there's light after everything." She smiled softly, her heart aching a little for him. "It's strange how we carry our burdens for so long, thinking that we have to carry them alone. But then we meet someone and somehow it feels like we don't have to." He looked at her, his expression thoughtful, as if he was still trying to wrap his mind around what had happened. "I don't know how to explain it. I've been through so much and I thought that I could handle it all myself. But then you came into my life and it's like you've made me see that I don't have to. You've made me realize that I can ask for help, and I don't know if I'd have been able to do that without you." Her heart swelled at his words, but she kept her voice steady. "I didn't do anything special. I was just there. Sometimes that's all we need. Someone to be there, not to fix things, but just to listen, to let us feel heard." "I don't think I ever understood that," he said, a hint of disbelief in his voice. "How much something as simple as listening could change everything. I've been trying to fix everything for so long, trying to hold everything together. But I forgot that sometimes the best thing we can do is just be there." They sat in silence for a while, the quiet of the park surrounding them. The woman could feel the weight of his words, the depth of his realization. She had always known that healing wasn't about fixing things. It was about learning to live with the scars, to find strength in the broken places. But hearing him say it, hearing him recognize that truth for himself, made her heart ache with pride for him. Finally, after a long pause, she spoke again. "You know, I've realized something too. I've always been the one who listens, who helps others through their struggles. But I never really let anyone in. I kept everything locked up inside. I didn't want to burden anyone with my own stuff. But with you, it's different. It's like I don't have to be the strong one all the time." His eyes softened as he looked at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I think that's one of the things I admire about you. You don't try to be perfect. You're just real. And that's what makes everything feel easier. You don't try to fix me. You just let me be." The words felt like a balm to her heart. She had spent so long trying to fix things, to make everything better for everyone else, that she had forgotten what it felt like to just let things be. But with him, she didn't have to carry the weight of perfection. She could just be herself, flawed, uncertain, but real. As the evening continued, they talked about their hopes for the future. They didn't make any grand promises or plans, but there was an understanding between them, an unspoken agreement that whatever happened next, they would face it together. They didn't need to rush anything. The connection between them was already deep enough to weather whatever came their way. The next few weeks were filled with more shared moments, quiet dinners, walks in the park, late-night conversations about life and what it meant to truly live. They didn't need to talk about the past anymore. They didn't need to focus on what had been lost. Instead, they talked about what was ahead, the small joys, the quiet victories, the simple pleasures that made life worth living. In the days that followed, the woman noticed changes within herself as well. She felt more open, more willing to embrace vulnerability. She had always been afraid of what might happen if she let herself rely on someone else. But with him, she felt safe. It was a different kind of strength, one that didn't require shutting off emotions or putting up walls. It was a strength that came from trust, from knowing that it was okay to lean on another person. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset, he turned to her with a serious look on his face. "There's something I've been thinking about," he said, his voice steady. "I've been through a lot, and so have you. And we've both been carrying things that we didn't need to. But I think it's time we stop carrying them alone." Her heart skipped a beat, her pulse quickening at the weight of his words. She looked at him, unsure of what he meant, but sensing that something important was coming. "I don't know what the future holds," he continued, "but I do know that I don't want to face it without you. You've shown me what it means to be vulnerable, to let someone in, and I think that's the greatest gift anyone could give me." Her breath caught in her throat as she looked at him, her mind racing. She didn't need him to fix everything. She didn't need grand gestures or promises of forever. All she needed was this, his honesty, his willingness to be vulnerable with her. And in that moment, she realized that she felt the same way. She didn't need to know what the future held either. All she needed was to be present, to embrace the connection they had built, and to see where it would lead. "I don't know what the future holds either," she said softly, "but I think we're in the right place now, and that's enough." The sunset stretched out before them, a brilliant display of color and light, but it wasn't the sky that made the moment feel so perfect. It was the quiet understanding between them, the knowledge that no matter what happened, they had found something real. And that was enough to carry them forward.